Hey everyone, this is Jessica Nelson, and I wanted to do a tutorial today to talk about noise and reduction of noise and my process because as a wildlife shooter, I tend to get quite a bit of noise in my images, and I'll explain that in a minute. And I also get a lot of questions on my process and how I reduce the noise when I do my post-processing. So I thought I would go ahead and do a tutorial that explained both those things. So I do a lot of shooting in the woods. A lot of times, even if it's the middle of the day, the woods can be dark and there can be lots of shadows. And so I'm often making sure that my exposure is correct by bumping up my ISO quite a bit. I shoot with a Canon 7D, which is a crop sensor, so it doesn't handle noise as well as a full frame, but I like using a crop sensor because it gives me a little bit more reach to get a little closer to my subjects. And I also have a Sigma 150 to 600 lens, which is a variable aperture lens, and it doesn't go as wide open as some of the other prime lenses that are telephoto on the market. My lens is a 5 to 6.3. The way out shooting at 600 millimeter, the lowest f-stop I can go is an f6.3. And like I mentioned, there's lots of other telephoto lenses on the market that are prime that will go lower than a 5, but unfortunately they are a little bit out of my price range. So I love my lens. I have no issues with using it. It's very heavy, so one of the things that I have to do when I'm shooting is make sure that my shutter speed is pretty high, unless I'm in a situation where I'm using a tripod, which isn't very often. I find that very limiting for me when I'm shooting the birds. Or in this particular case, the picture that I have up on the screen here, I had the camera sitting on my window ledge using it as a prop so that I could bring my shutter speed down. But most of the time when I'm shooting birds or any other wild animal, because they move so fast, I try not to keep my shutter speed lower than at least 1 over 8,000, 1 over 800 where I keep it. So between 800 and 1,000 for shutter speed. So in doing that, what happens is, because I can't go lower than an f6.3, in order for me to keep good exposure, I have to bump up my ISO. So what I want to talk about is the noise that is generated in those pictures, I find is acceptable to me. Now, I know there's a lot of people who try to minimize noise as much as possible. I try to do that too. But in some cases, when I'm trying to capture something that I know, even if my lighting situation is not great, I still want to capture that bird or whatever it is that I'm shooting, I will take the grain and I will just deal with whatever I have to worry about in post-processing, because getting the picture of whatever it is that I'm shooting, especially with birds that I'm trying to capture a special one, a different one, something that I want to remember when I get home, I just embrace the grain and move on. It just doesn't really bother me. So this case, this bird was in my yard for only 2 days this week. He's a special bird. It's a rose-breasted grosbeak. They only come during this time of year in the spring. They show up at my feeder for like I said, like 2 to 3 days. And of course, it happened to be the day that this guy showed up where it was raining, it was icky out, it was very overcast, the light was just awful. And the only thing I could do was raise my ISO and just kind of cross my fingers that the noise wasn't too bad. So you can see over here my settings were ISO 16,000, which is as high as I will go on my camera. I actually have it set so that it won't go any higher than that. So ISO 16,000 is my top limit. I was shooting full at 600 millimeters, which is the longest my lens will go. And then the lowest aperture that I could have it set to on my lens, because it's a variable aperture, is f6.3. And then, like I mentioned, I went ahead and reduced my shutter speed down quite a bit because I was able to do that sitting on my window ledge so that it wouldn't shake my lens or my camera too much, because I was able to brace it on something. So I brought it down to 1 over 200 so that I could see if I could get decent exposure. But as you can tell, I'll zoom in a bit. You can see that there's quite a lot of noise all around my bird, my background especially, and any places that are dark. So in order to work with that or reduce that, there's a couple ways that I go about doing this. Now, I will say that I'm not going to go into the full edit on this photo. I've already kind of manipulated it a bit. I can show you the before and after. This is what it looked like before. The greens were pretty neon, so I worked with reducing the greens, bringing down my highlights, making sure that everything was a little bit less yellow and more green. But I'm not going to go into the full edit. But what I will do now is say that there are a couple of ways that I reduce noise. The first thing you can do is you can actually use Lightroom to bring your noise down. So if you go down to your noise reduction panel, which is under your details, if you bring up the luminance, let's just bring it up quite a bit to about 80 just so I can show you what it does. If you bring that up, it will reduce the noise quite a bit, and it does a very good job of reducing noise. The background looks a lot smoother, the leaves look a lot smoother, my bird obviously looks a lot smoother. So I'll zoom back in again, you can see. I like the effect that this noise reduction has on the background, and of course you can play with the smoothness, you can make sure that the details stay more sharp than others. You can change the color in terms of how much color noise reduction it's removing. So if you go towards the left, it will reduce it more than on the right. And of course, playing with the sliders kind of helps a little bit here and there, and then contrast. But what I don't like, and the reason why I don't do this very often, is I don't like how smooth my bird looks after I do noise reduction on a global level like Lightroom. So while bringing up the noise reduction maybe no higher than like 10 or so will help like fix the background a bit, so I brought it back down quite a lot. I'll fix my color and my smoothness. You can see that it's not doing as much when I bring the luminance back down, which is good because as much as I like the noise reduction on the background, I really don't like it on my bird. So instead of doing it this way, I'm going to turn this off so that there's no noise reduction on this photo at all. Because in general, I want my subjects to be sharp. I want their eyes to be sharp, I want their beaks to be sharp, and I would really prefer to have their feathers and their feet be clear. So I don't prefer to globally change my noise reduction in Lightroom, and instead I do it in Photoshop. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to actually export this photo out. I'm going to export it out to a file, and this is how I generally do my processing. I do all my global edits in Lightroom. I export the file out as a JPEG. I open it up, and I do all my edits in Photoshop. Obviously, there's many other ways to do that. If you wanted to just do a right click on that file and do edit in Photoshop, that's fine too. This is just how I've always done it. It's just easier for me to continue with my workflow the same way. So here's the photo that I just exported out, and I'm going to right click, open it up, bring it into Photoshop, and I'll show you how I do noise reduction here. So here's the same file. Nothing else has changed. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to duplicate the photo on a separate layer. And then under Filters, I have a Noiseware plugin made by Imagenomic. I'm not exactly sure how to say that. Imagenomic? I don't care. Anyway, it's Noiseware, and you can purchase that. This is where I buy it from, Imagenomic. I think a lot of people use this Noiseware program. I particularly use it. I think it's the best one. They also make portraiture. So this is what I use. So I'm going to go back here, go back to my plugin, and I'm going to run Noiseware. So this gives me a bunch of choices here. So what I'm going to look at is the noise reduction in the background. Now, of course, it's not going to be perfect. This was shot at ISO 16000. And it's not going to look the same as where you do your noise reduction in Lightroom because this is a JPEG file, not a RAW file. So it's a little bit harder to reduce the noise here, but I still find that it's worth it. You have a bunch of different choices on the side here. Your default setting is kind of on the lighter side, and then you've got a whole bunch of other things that you can try. Like if I were going to do night scene, you can see that it doesn't reduce it quite as much. If you click on it, it shows you what it was before and then a preview of what it is now. In general, I try to use the full strong color noise. I find that it works the best for my images most of the time because I'm using lots of deep color, lots of colorful birds, lots of colorful scenery, lots of greenery. This works the best. So I'm going to say OK here. And now you can see that it looks fairly smooth. It looks almost as smooth as if I had done it in Lightroom. And I'll bring it up a little bit. Oops, sorry. And you can see that there's still a little bit of color noise here and there, but for the most part, it did a pretty good job of getting rid of the noise. Okay, so now what I do is I add a layer mask, and for some reason I moved the top layer, and let me push that back. I didn't mean to do that. Okay, so I'm going to add a mask here, and there's two ways that I go about spot removing my noise. So I'm either going to leave it globally turned on and I will brush off the bird. So in this case, I will leave it like this and I will get a black brush set fairly high, probably around 90. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to brush the noise back on. And the reason I'm brushing the noise back on is because I want, and even though it's noisy and you can see the noise, I want the detail to come back out in my bird and its feathers and the feet. But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to remove the noise reduction around the edges because I like it on the background and I like it on the leaves and in some cases some of the branches. But I am going to, some of the branches that should be in focus, that should be clear, I'm going to go ahead and brush those off as well. So that's one way to do it. I'm going to remove that layer and do something else. The second way to do it is to do it the opposite way. So let's say I have a larger subject in my photo and I want to brush the noise where the noise canceling around instead of the bird itself. So I'm going to run it one more time. So I did the exact same thing. I'm sorry, I didn't. I'm going to duplicate my layer and then I'm going to run it one more time. Okay, so now I did the exact same thing one more time. I'm going to add my layer mask, and in this case I'm going to do a Command I or Control I on a PC, and what it did was it removed the filter across the entire thing. So now the noise where is not being shown anywhere. Instead, I'm going to brush on the noise where I want it. And I keep saying noise where, it's noise reduction, noise where is the plugin. So let's just say my bird was really, really big and I really just wanted to brush on noise reduction where I wanted it. So instead of doing it the way I did it the first time, you can invert the layer mask and just brush on with a white brush any place that you would like to have noise reduction. Now, in this case, with a smaller subject in the middle here, doing it the first way is a little bit easier. You'd have to kind of come in a little bit around the bird and try not to get too much where you don't want it in the middle. But either way to do it works the same. Okay, so if I turn this off, you can see noise is everywhere, and when I turn it on, noise is just on my bird. And I like to keep it that way so that everything that is detail oriented, the eyes, the beak, the feet, some of the branches, and the